Odessa Grant had already buried one son. She had no idea she was about to lose a second to the very billionaire paying him to destroy her. She did not know any of it while it was happening. She did not know that every Tuesday and Thursday, after the boy packed up his books and said goodnight, he walked 2 blocks north and climbed into the back of a car that did not belong to anyone in her neighborhood. She did not know that somewhere across the city, in an office on the 40th floor of a building she would never set foot in, a man was reading notes about her life, written in her own foster child's handwriting. She only knew that for the first time in 10 years, since she buried her only son, her house had a heartbeat in it again. She had no idea that heartbeat had been placed there to be watched. His name was Julian Reese, and he was 15 years old, and he had already lived in 3 homes before hers. He did not trust easily, and he had good reason not to. But Odessa never asked him to trust her. She simply left a plate warm on the stove every night whether he came home hungry or not, and slowly, without either of them naming it, something in him began to soften. What Julian carried in his backpack, tucked beneath his textbooks, was a small notebook that had nothing to do with school. In it were dates, times, details about a woman who had done nothing but try to save him. And every week, that notebook made its way into the hands of a billionaire named Elias Kingston, a man deciding, quite literally, whether Odessa's life's work deserved to survive. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. Odessa was not being investigated because anyone suspected her of a crime. She was being investigated because Elias Kingston had been burned before by charities that took his money and gave nothing back, by promises that turned out to be empty rooms behind a good name. He had built a foundation with the power to fund community programs across the entire city, programs like the one Odessa ran out of her own home for free, feeding and tutoring children the system had already given up on. But before he would sign a single check, he needed proof. And the boy he had quietly placed in her care through the foster system was that proof, whether Julian understood it or not in the beginning. What no one could have predicted was what actually happened once Julian moved in. He had been told to watch her. He had not been told what to do if he started to care about her. Every night he wrote down what he saw, and every night what he saw made it harder to write the report Elias Kingston actually wanted. He saw a woman who gave away food she could not spare. He saw a woman who stayed up past midnight helping a boy she had known for 6 weeks with fractions, because no one had ever bothered to before. And somewhere in the space between the assignment he had been given and the life he was actually living, Julian Reese began asking himself a question he never expected to have to answer. What happens when the person you were sent to expose turns out to be the only person who has ever truly seen you? There were 3 people at the center of this story, and only one of them knew the whole truth from the beginning. Odessa believed she was simply mentoring a struggling teenager. Julian believed he was completing an assignment that would decide where he lived next. And Elias Kingston believed he was protecting his money from one more person who would disappoint him the way so many others already had. None of them knew that this arrangement, built quietly behind closed doors and signed paperwork, was about to unravel every single one of their assumptions about who deserved trust and who did not. And none of them could have guessed how close they already were, without realizing it, to a truth that would change all 3 of their lives forever. To understand why Odessa Grant did what she did, you have to go back 10 years, to a Tuesday in October when a police officer knocked on her door and told her that her son was gone. He was 17. He had walked to the corner store for a bag of chips and never walked back. There was no trial that gave her closure, no neat ending that made sense of it. Only a folded flag of grief that she carried alone for the better part of a decade. She kept his room exactly as he left it for 3 years before she could bring herself to change anything. Neighbors said she disappeared into herself after that. What they did not see was the moment, roughly 2 years later, when she decided that if she could not save her own son, she would spend whatever life she had left trying to save someone else's. She started small. 1 child from down the street who was falling behind in math. Then 2, then 5, then 12, gathered around her kitchen table and her secondhand couch on weekday afternoons, fed on whatever she could stretch her grocery budget to cover. She never called it a program. She never asked the city for money. She simply opened her door, over and over, until word spread through the neighborhood that there was a woman on Willow Street who would help you with your homework and would not let you leave hungry. Within a few years, without ever intending to, Odessa Grant had built something that looked, from the outside, exactly like the kind of community organization a foundation might one day want to fund, and exactly like the kind of operation a skeptical man might want investigated first. There was a particular evening, 3 years into her work, that neighbors still talked about. A boy named Terrence, 12 years old, showed up at her door soaked from the rain with a black eye he refused to explain. Odessa did not call anyone. She did not ask a single question that night. She simply handed him a towel, sat him at her table, and fed him until he was ready to talk on his own terms, which took nearly 2 hours of silence before he finally did. It became the quiet rule of her house that no child would ever be forced to explain their pain before they were ready, and it was that same rule, unspoken and unwritten anywhere, that would later make Julian Reese's first weeks in her home so different from every placement he had known before. Julian Reese's story started very differently, but it was heading, without either of them knowing it, toward the same kitchen table. He had been placed in his first foster home at 8 years old, after his mother lost a battle with addiction that the whole neighborhood had watched happen in slow motion. He was quiet in a way that worried teachers, brilliant in a way that surprised them, and guarded in a way that made every placement after the first one a little harder than the last. By the time he turned 15, he had learned the one lesson that every child in the system eventually learns, that people rarely stay, and that the safest thing to do is never expect them to. He was not looking for a home. He was counting down the years until he could leave the system entirely and owe no one anything. His second placement had ended badly, a family that took the monthly stipend and gave him a mattress in an unfinished basement in return. His third placement ended quietly, a well-meaning couple who simply could not handle a boy who flinched at raised voices and refused to explain why. By the time his caseworker mentioned a fourth placement on Willow Street, Julian had already built a wall so complete that he barely registered the news at all. He packed the same single duffel bag he always packed, and he did not ask a single question about the woman he was about to live with, because in his experience, questions never changed the outcome anyway. What Julian did not know, when his caseworker told him about a new placement on Willow Street, was that the placement had not been chosen at random. Elias Kingston's foundation had flagged Odessa's program for review months earlier, and someone on his staff had quietly arranged, through channels that were technically legal but morally uncomfortable, for a foster placement that would put a set of watching eyes inside her home. Julian was never told the full extent of what he was being used for. He was told only that he would be checking in with a caseworker more frequently than usual, and that anything unusual he noticed about the household should be written down. 15 years old and desperate for stability, he did not ask enough questions. He simply moved in. The first night was almost unremarkable, and that alone unsettled him. Odessa did not lecture him about house rules the way the last family had. She showed him his room, told him dinner was at 6, but the stove stayed warm past midnight if he ever came home later than that, and left him alone to unpack in peace. He wrote his very first entry that night, 3 clipped lines about arrival time and the layout of the house, exactly the kind of note he assumed was expected of him. He had no way of knowing yet that this particular house did not run on the same rules as every house before it. The first few weeks were exactly what Julian expected from every placement before it: careful distance on both sides, polite conversation, a woman who fed him but did not yet know him. He wrote his notes dutifully. Wake time, bedtime, who came and went from the house. It read like the reports he imagined she wanted, sterile and factual, nothing that could hurt anyone. But somewhere around the 6th week, something shifted that Julian did not have language for yet. Odessa noticed he flinched when raised voices came from the television. She turned it off without a word and never mentioned it again. Nobody had ever done something so small for him before, and it cracked something open that he had spent years keeping sealed shut. By the second month, Odessa had stopped feeling like a stranger and started feeling like something Julian did not yet have a name for. She taught him to knot a tie the night before a school interview, standing behind him at the bathroom mirror, correcting his hands with the patience of someone who had done this before, for someone else, a long time ago. She never told him about her son directly, not yet, but there were nights he caught her staring at a closed bedroom door down the hall with an expression he could not place. He started coming home faster after school instead of lingering with other kids on the corner. He started, without meaning to, wanting to be there. There was one evening, roughly 10 weeks in, when Julian came home to find Odessa sitting alone at the kitchen table with an old photograph in her hands, not hiding it, simply looking at it the way you look at something you have looked at 1,000 times before. He almost walked past without asking. Instead, for the first time since he arrived, he sat down across from her and asked who it was. She told him only that it was someone she used to cook for, and let the conversation end there. But she did not put the photograph away. She left it propped against the napkin holder for the rest of the week, and Julian noticed, without saying anything, that it stayed there every time he came home. And that was exactly the problem, because every week, a car still came for him, and every week, the notes in his notebook grew harder to write, not because there was nothing to report, but because everything he now knew about Odessa Grant made him feel sick writing any of it down at all. He began to understand, slowly and painfully, that he had been placed in that house not to be cared for, but to gather the very intimacy he was now starting to feel and had no way to unfeel. Julian Reese was 15 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was going to have to choose between the only safety he had ever been offered and the truth of what that safety had actually cost. Across town, in an office on the 40th floor, the pressure on Julian's assignment had already started building weeks before he felt it directly. Elias Kingston's foundation managed grant applications from nearly 200 community organizations across the city, and Odessa's file had been sitting in a stack marked for special review since the day an anonymous complaint suggested her program was collecting donations under the table without reporting them properly. Priscilla Hart, who ran field verification for the foundation, had recommended the foster placement herself, arguing that the fastest way to settle the question quietly was to place a reliable set of eyes inside the home rather than send auditors who would spook whatever was actually happening there. Elias had approved it with barely a second thought, one file among 200, until the week everything changed. The call came on a Thursday evening, while Julian was still at Odessa's kitchen table finishing a worksheet she had printed out for him at her own expense. It was not from his caseworker. It was from Priscilla Hart, and her voice on the phone was calm in a way that made the request feel worse, not better. She told Julian that the foundation's board meeting had been moved up. She told him that a decision about Odessa's funding, and by extension her entire that night, unable to sleep, Julian did something he had never let himself do before. He walked quietly down the hall and stood outside the door of the room he was forbidden, by unspoken rule, from entering. Through the crack beneath it, he could see a sliver of light, and beneath that door, for the first time, he heard Odessa crying, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere old and worn down by years of carrying it alone. He had never once, in 2 months, heard her make a sound like that in front of him. And it hit him then, harder than anything Priscilla Hart had said on the phone, that the woman on the other side of that door had already lost everything once, and had rebuilt her entire life out of nothing but the decision to help people like him. He was being asked to be the reason she lost it all a second time. He did not sleep at all that night, and the following morning he nearly told her everything over breakfast, the words rising in his throat before he swallowed them back down out of fear that saying them out loud would make them true before he had decided what to do about them. Odessa noticed nothing unusual, only that he picked at his food a little longer than normal, and she chalked it up to a hard week at school. She had no idea that the boy sitting across from her had, 12 hours earlier, listened to her grieve through a closed door and had spent the entire night deciding whether her life's work was worth protecting at the cost of his own safety net. The following afternoon, Julian found himself standing in Odessa's small home office, a manila folder of receipts and grant paperwork open on the desk in front of him, exactly the kind of documentation Priscilla Hart had asked for. His phone was out. All he had to do was take the pictures and send them, and whatever happened next would no longer be his responsibility. His hand was steady. His mind was not. He thought of the warm plate left out for him on nights he came home late without calling. He thought of her hands correcting his at the mirror, teaching him to tie a knot no one had ever taught him before. And he thought, for the first time in years, about what it might cost him personally, not just professionally, to be the reason it all disappeared. He did not send the photos. Instead, he closed the folder, closed the door behind him exactly the way he had found it. and sat down at the kitchen table with a blank page in his notebook and a decision forming in his chest that he did not yet have the courage to act on fully. He picked up his pen, and for the first time since he had arrived on Willow Street, he began to write something that was not a report at all. It was the truth, in his own words, about who Odessa Grant actually was. What he did not know yet was that this single choice, made quietly at a kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday night, was about to collide with something Odessa herself was seconds away from discovering, in the very notebook he had just started writing in. Odessa found the notebook by accident, the way most devastating discoveries happen, in the middle of an ordinary chore. She was gathering laundry from Julian's room while he was at school, and the notebook slipped out from beneath a stack of folded shirts and landed open on the floor at her feet. She almost did not read it. She almost picked it up and set it back exactly where it had fallen, the way she had trained herself over the years not to pry into a child's private things. But a single word caught her eye before she could look away, her own name, followed by a date, followed by a description of what she had cooked for dinner 3 Tuesdays ago. Her hands went cold before her mind had even caught up to what she was looking at. She sat down on the edge of Julian's bed and read the entire notebook from the first page to the last, and with every page, something in her chest hardened a little further. Wake times, bedtimes, notes about visitors, notes about her moods. It read exactly like what it was, surveillance, dressed up as a teenager's homework notebook, and it took her only a few pages to understand that this had never been an accident, that Julian's placement in her home had been arranged by someone with a reason to watch her, and that for 2 months she had opened her house and her grief to a child who had been sent there to catalog her. Her first instinct, sitting there on his bed with the notebook still open in her lap, was to keep reading, past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped, because some small part of her needed to know exactly how far back it went. What she found on the very first page stopped her cold. The earliest entry was dated the same week Julian had arrived, before he had ever eaten a meal at her table, before he had any reason at all to have an opinion about her. Someone had told him what to look for before he ever walked through her door. This had not started as a boy slowly turning suspicious of a woman he lived with. It had started as an assignment, handed to a child who had not yet met her, by people who had already decided who she was. That distinction changed everything about how she read the rest of it. And by the time she reached the final page, her grief had curdled into something closer to fury, not at Julian, but at whoever had decided her life's work was worth investigating through a 15-year-old's eyes instead of an honest conversation at her own front door. When Julian came home that afternoon, he knew something was wrong before he even reached the door, because Odessa was sitting at the kitchen table where he usually sat, the notebook closed in front of her, her hands folded on top of it the way you fold your hands at a funeral. He did not need her to say anything. He saw his own notebook on the table and felt the floor of his stomach drop out entirely. There are conversations a person spends their whole life dreading, and this was his. He sat down across from her because there was nowhere else to go, and for a long moment, neither of them said a single word. It was Julian who broke first, and once he started talking, he could not stop. He told her about Priscilla Hart. He told her about Elias Kingston. He told her about the board meeting, about the demand for financial records and names, about the folder he had stood in front of the day before with his phone in his hand, ready to photograph her private paperwork and send it to strangers who would decide her fate from a boardroom she had never seen. And then he told her the part that mattered most, that he had not sent it, that he had closed the folder and walked away, that whatever he had been sent to do, he had not been able to finish doing it to her. Odessa did not respond the way he expected. She did not yell. She did not throw him out that same night the way 3 previous households already had, over far smaller things than this. Instead, she sat very still, staring at the boy across the table who had just confessed to being placed in her home as an instrument against her, and felt something break open inside her that she had been holding shut since the day she buried her son. She had built her entire life around the belief that giving people a place to land was the only thing that mattered. And now the person she had given the most to was the same person who had been sent to take it all away. She told him, quietly, that she needed time. And then she told him to go to his room, not out of cruelty, but because she genuinely did not know, in that moment, what she was supposed to feel. For 3 days, the house on Willow Street went nearly silent. Odessa fed Julian out of habit rather than warmth. leaving plates on the counter instead of the stove. A small change neither of them said out loud, but both of them understood completely. Julian, certain he had already lost the one place that had ever felt close to home, began quietly preparing himself for the caseworker's next call, packing his duffel bag halfway before unpacking it again each night, unable to decide whether leaving first would hurt less than being sent away. It was the kind of silence that neighbors mistake for peace, and only two people in that house knew how close it actually was to ending everything. What neither of them knew, as Julian sat alone that night replaying every kindness Odessa had ever shown him against every note he had ever written about her, was that across the city, Elias Kingston had just opened an envelope containing something he had not expected to receive at all, a handwritten letter from a 15-year-old boy that had nothing to do with surveillance and everything to do with the truth. And that letter was about to change the outcome of this entire story before the week was even over. Elias Kingston read Julian's letter twice before he allowed himself to believe what was in front of him. It was not the report Priscilla Hart had requested. There were no financial records, no names, no evidence of wrongdoing of any kind. Instead, it was 3 handwritten pages describing, in plain and unpolished language, what it felt like to be fed by someone who had nothing left to give and gave it anyway. It described a plate kept warm on the stove. It described a woman who turned off a television without a word rather than ask why a child flinched at raised voices. It described, without ever using the word, what it felt like to be loved by someone with no obligation to love you at all. Elias set the letter down on his desk and sat very still for a long time. He had not expected to feel anything reading it. He had built the last 20 years of his life around not feeling much of anything when it came to charity, because feeling something was how people like him got taken advantage of in the first place. But there was a sentence near the end of Julian's letter that undid him completely, one that described the exact bathroom mirror where Odessa had taught him to knot a tie, correcting his hands the way you correct the hands of someone you have done this for before. Elias Kingston had grown up 2 blocks from Willow Street, in a house that no longer stood, raised for a time by a woman not so different from Odessa Grant, who had taught a scared and guarded boy exactly the same lesson at exactly the same kind of mirror, decades before he had a foundation, or a fortune, or any reason to trust anyone again. Her name had been Miss Adeline, and she had run the exact same kind of kitchen table operation Odessa now ran, feeding neighborhood children on nothing but her own determination, decades before anyone thought to call it a nonprofit or a program. Elias had been 11 years old when his own mother took 2 jobs, and still could not keep the lights on some months, and it was Miss Adeline who fed him 3 nights a week without ever once making him feel like charity, until the day her own health failed and the kitchen table closed for good. He had been 16 by then, old enough to understand what he had lost, and he had promised himself, in the raw and overconfident way teenagers make promises, that he would find a way to pay her back one day. He never did. She passed away before he had built anything worth offering her, and the guilt of that unpaid debt was the real reason, buried under 20 years of boardrooms and spreadsheets, that he had built a foundation obsessed with proof in the first place. He had convinced himself he was protecting his money. He had actually been protecting himself from ever loving someone he could not save again. He had never told his staff that story. He had built his entire public image around being a self-made man who owed his success to nothing but discipline and instinct. And there was a version of the truth he had quietly buried, that before any of that, there had been a woman who fed him when his own family could not, who believed in him before there was any evidence he was worth believing in. He had lost touch with her before he ever had the means to repay what she had given him, and for years he told himself it did not matter, that he had moved on, that gratitude was a debt better left unpaid than dwelled upon. Julian's letter had cracked that story wide open, because it was not describing Odessa Grant at all. It was describing her. Elias called Priscilla Hart into his office that same afternoon and asked her a single question that stopped her mid-sentence, whether she had ever once, in all her years running field verification, actually met any of the people whose lives she was investigating from a distance. She did not have a good answer. He told her to cancel the emergency board meeting scheduled for that Friday, and to reschedule it for Monday instead, because he intended to visit Willow Street in person before a single vote was cast, something he had never done for any grant recipient in the history of his foundation. Elias called an emergency meeting with his foundation's board the following Monday, and he did something none of them expected. He did not present financial records or proof of fraud, because there was none to present. He read them Julian's letter, word for word, and watched grown executives who approved and denied millions of dollars in funding every year sit in uncomfortable silence at the description of a warm plate and a corrected knot in a tie. When he finished, he told them plainly that Odessa Grant's program would not only be funded, it would be used as the model for every community program his foundation touched going forward, and that he intended to deliver that news himself, in person, on Willow Street, something he had not done for any grant recipient in the history of his foundation. Back on Willow Street, Odessa had spent 3 days in a fog of grief and betrayal, unsure whether to send Julian back into the system or to somehow find a way to keep going as though the notebook had never existed. She had not decided anything yet when a car she recognized pulled up outside her home, the same car that had come for Julian every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 months. But this time, it was not Julian who stepped out of it. It was a man in his 60s she had never met in her life, standing on her front porch with an envelope in his hand and an expression on his face that looked, for reasons she could not yet understand, like a man returning somewhere he had been trying to find his way back to for 30 years. Odessa did not invite him inside right away. She stood in her doorway with her arms crossed, and she asked him plainly who he was and why a man she had never met was standing on her porch the same week her home had been used as a surveillance operation. Elias did not defend himself. He did not mention funding, or foundations, or boards. He told her, instead, about a boy who grew up 2 blocks from where she now stood, raised for a time by a woman who fed him when no one else would, who taught him to knot a tie at a bathroom mirror the exact same way Julian had described in his letter. He told her he had spent 30 years building a fortune and had never once found a way to properly thank the person who made any of it possible, and that reading Julian's letter had felt, for the first time in decades, like being handed a second chance he had no right to expect. Odessa listened to all of it standing in her doorway, and when he finished, she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in, not because his money had earned it, but because something in the way he spoke about that mirror sounded exactly like a boy who had once needed saving and never forgot who had done it. They sat at the same kitchen table where Julian had confessed everything 3 days earlier, and for the first time since finding the notebook, Odessa let herself hear a version of this story that was not only about betrayal. Julian came home from school to find them both there, and he froze in the doorway, certain for a moment that Elias had come to collect him, to end the placement, to finish undoing everything he had tried to protect by refusing to send those photographs. Instead, Elias stood up, walked over to him, and told him the truth plainly. He was not being taken anywhere. He had, without knowing it, done something braver than anyone on that foundation's board had done in years. He had told the truth even when a lie would have been easier and safer for him personally. Julian did not have words for what he felt in that moment, only that for the first time since he had entered the foster system, an adult had looked at him and seen exactly who he was, and had not been disappointed. Odessa asked, quietly, why Elias's staff had chosen her house specifically, out of 200 programs on file, and Elias answered honestly, that it had been chance and paperwork and nothing more, an anonymous complaint and a convenient placement, until a 15-year-old boy turned that cold accident into something that mattered. He told her he intended to have a long conversation with Priscilla Hart about how his foundation verified the people it claimed to be helping, and that Willow Street would be the last program ever investigated through the eyes of a child rather than an honest conversation at a kitchen table like the one they were sitting at right now. In the weeks that followed, Elias Kingston did exactly what he had promised his board. Odessa's program was fully funded, not as a trial, not with conditions attached, but as the founding model for a citywide initiative that would eventually carry her name. She was given the resources to hire help, to expand into the building next door, to stop stretching her own grocery budget to feed children who were not legally hers, but had become hers in every way that mattered. And Julian, given the choice for the first time in his life about where he wanted to stay, chose Willow Street, not because a case file told him to, but because it was the first place that had ever felt like his to choose. There was one afternoon, not long after the funding was announced, when Odessa finally opened the door down the hall that she had not let Julian enter in the 2 months since he'd arrived. She showed him the room exactly as it had been left and told him, for the first time, The whole story of the son she had lost and the decade of grief that had led her to open her door to strangers in the first place. Julian sat on the edge of that bed and listened the way she had once listened to him, without needing him to explain his pain before he was ready, and when she finished, he told her quietly that he intended to stay on Willow Street for good, if she would still have him. She did not answer with words. She simply reached over and adjusted the knot of his tie, the way she had done that first time at the mirror, and let her hand rest on his shoulder a moment longer than necessary. A year later, on the anniversary of the week, everything nearly fell apart. Elias returned to Willow Street for the opening of what was now officially called the Grant Family Center, a converted storefront 2 doors down from Odessa's original home, filled with children doing homework at long tables under bright lights that never had to be paid for out of anyone's personal grocery money again. Odessa stood at the front of the room, and she did not read from any prepared notes. She told the crowd that she had once buried a son and had spent 10 years afraid to let herself love anyone that much again. She told them that a boy had walked into her home carrying a notebook meant to end everything she had spent a decade building, and that instead of destroying her, he had become the reason all of it multiplied. And she said one more thing before she stepped down, looking directly at the boy standing beside her the entire time, that some of the best things that ever happened to us arrived disguised as the very thing we were most afraid of. Julian stood beside her through every word, no longer a placement, no longer an assignment, simply and finally her son. If you are watching this and wondering whether people are still capable of choosing honesty when a lie would be so much easier, we hope this story answered that question the way it deserves to be answered. Let us know in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most, and if you believe second chances are still possible, even for the people who almost destroyed everything. Tell us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told.